For many Canadians, the recent diplomatic spat between Canada and China over Huawei pointed to clandestine activities that most people know nothing about. But such matters are no surprise to Jonathan Manthorpe. He spent 4 decades abroad as a Canadian foreign correspondent, much of it in China. His new book, Claws of the Panda, Beijing's Campaign of Influence and Intimidation in Canada, explores some very under-examined elements in the relations between our two nations. And Jonathan Manthorpe joins us now on the line from Victoria, British Columbia. Jonathan, it's great to have you on our program. How are you tonight?
I'm fine, Steve. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Not at all. Let's, as we tell this story of the relationship over the last many decades between Canada and China, start with a group called the Mish Kids. Who are they?
Well, this goes back, in fact, to the 1920s and 30s, Steve. Canada had a very strong missionary presence in China, in fact, going back to the 1880s, but it was in the 1920s and 30s that it really came to strength. Most of them were from the United Church of Canada. They were in 2 centers, one in Henan, in sort of central eastern China, and perhaps the most important one was in Chengdu in Sichuan province. The missionaries, of course, led ordinary lives, and many of them had children who were born and grew up in China and who spoke Chinese, who had absorbed Chinese culture from their birth. And many of them became very significant as Canada began to develop its own foreign policy after the Second World War.
Well, to that end, I'll fast forward a bit and talk about the current Prime Minister's father, who, of course, staged a significant opening to China well before the United States did. Why did Pierre Trudeau want to open to China when he probably knew it was going to cost him some currency in his relationship with the Americans?
Yeah, well, of course, Pierre Trudeau, he had traveled in China by himself and with friends many years before. Pierre Trudeau had a different view of the world from many of us, as those of us who sort of lived through that period will remember. And he could see no reason why Canada should not have diplomatic recognition with a country of then, 800 million people. So from the very start, from his early life in politics through to becoming Prime Minister, he had determined that one of his early initiatives would be to establish diplomatic relations with China, which he did in 1970.
And becoming the first Canadian Prime Minister ever to visit there, what particular things did he do to woo the Chinese to open up to Canada?
Well, I think they had actually, they'd fixed on Canada as the sort of first world nation that they wanted to have diplomatic relations with many years before, and they had mounted a very significant influence campaign in China, starting, in fact, in the mid-60s, early 60s. They wanted Canada for 2 reasons. One, that it was next door to the United States, and 2, because we were then a leader in the United Nations and a leader in middle power democracies. And so China had picked on us as the useful first stride out into the world. With Pierre Trudeau, he came to power at just the right time for them. I think also, when one has to say that by that time, he was not working in defiance of the United States. By that period, the 1970s, U.S. under then President Nixon had decided it too wanted to improve relations with China in order to win one over on the Russians, the Soviet Union, as much as anything.
Well, in fact, Chairman Mao said after Canada and China had established relations, now we have made a friend in the backyard of America. Do you think that was really what was at the root of Chairman Mao's interest in relations with Canada?
It was certainly one of them, and I think the other thing, of course, was that once they'd established relations with Canada, in the next few years there were a dozen scores of other countries worked on the Canadian model of diplomatic relations with China, particularly as they referred to Taiwan and China's claim over Taiwan. Canada opened the doors to many other countries establishing diplomatic relations with China.
Your book does suggest that we have been supremely naive about China, we in the Western world, and I want to read an excerpt from the book to set up the next question on that. Here we go. When China began opening up in the 1980s, Western nations assumed that as the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, became a stakeholder on the global stage, it would adopt the values of the established international liberal democratic order. That is not what has happened. China has not emerged as a benign and benevolent beast. Far from it. It has all the hallmarks of a fascist regime if one accepts the definition of fascism as being a country with a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of the opposition. Why do you think our foreign policy consistently over the years gets China's motives so wrong?
Well, I think there are two things, really, Steve. One is we did and still do in some quarters have a very benign view of of how China acts, and I think there's actually quite a broad difference between the way Canada's elites, if you like, or Canada's political, business, and academic establishments view China, and the way ordinary Canadians do. Polls show that ordinary Canadians are much more skeptical about China and about the Chinese Communist Party and its objectives than our elites are. Our elites have been seduced very thoroughly by campaigns of influence by the Chinese Communist Party, and by and large it's worked. But this is not a benign regime, and that has become more and more evident, certainly since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012.
Do you think they are trying to export their brand of authoritarian capitalism around the world?
Well, certainly Xi Jinping has said on many occasions that he thinks that for developing countries, the CCP's brand of authoritarianism is a much better model for economic and social development than is democracy. How far and how able he's going to be to export that, I don't know, but he's certainly been very clear that he thinks the Chinese model is a much better one for developing countries than is sort of liberal democracy.
Let's do another excerpt from the book. Canada has become, you write, a battleground on which the Chinese Communist Party seeks to terrorize, humiliate, and neuter its opponents. It is a war being conducted in plain sight, but largely unremarked, as the CCP's diplomats, spies, security officers, and local agents of influence go about the daily business of trying to nullify the efforts of those it believes are set on overturning China's one-party state. It is a war of intimidation and harassment of Canadians and others. Okay, let's pull that apart a little bit here. China's United Front, what's that a reference to?
Well, the United Front Works Department is an extraordinary operation. Xi Jinping has called it his magic weapon. It's got a long history, which I won't bother to go into, but what it really amounts to is a political weapon. What the Chinese Communist Party does is set up all sorts of organizations that appear to be independent, that appear to be benign, and it's done it not only in Canada, but also in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, European countries, countries of Southeast Asia. And these organizations are there to promote Beijing's interests and specifically the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. There are a lot of them here in Canada, and for example, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service has been warning our political leaders about them since, the first report I remember seeing on this is 1997. So, for well over 20 years, our intelligence service have been telling our political leaders, look, the United Front Works Department is operating in Canada. It is being used both to push Beijing's view of the world, but also to contain and restrain and intimidate people in Canada who are working for reform in China and territories possessed by China.
Well, let's just hit that right on the head. Is there significant evidence that suggests that officials at Chinese embassies and or consulates in Canada and beyond are in fact spying on Chinese Canadian citizens in this country?
Well, there's a lot. And in chapter 1 of the book, I've set out a whole list of specific incidents of intimidation that are all on the public record. There were several more which I didn't include in the book, many more that I didn't include in the book because I tried on all occasions to get at least 2 or 3 substantiating sources for them. So there is a lot. And you will find in actually very recent publications by the Canadian Security Intelligence Services references to that. They had an academic outreach conference in March of last year, exactly 1 year ago. And the report that they produced as a result of that, which is public, available publicly, they cite in there the efforts by the United Front and the Chinese Communist Party to intimidate and control Canadians, most of them of Chinese heritage, but not exclusively so, as a way of curtailing people whom they consider to be dissidents.
So the idea is intimidate and control as opposed to finding anything out? Usually that's why you spy. You want to find stuff out. That's not it here?
Yeah, well, that's another arm. One of the objectives of the CCP's influence efforts here in Canada is also to acquire Canadian intellectual property. That's another thing from intimidation of people they consider dissidents here. But again, just referring back to the CSIS report of March last year, of its conference of March last year, that also says that all Chinese companies operating in Canada and elsewhere, whether they are publicly owned, state-owned, or private, have links to the Chinese Communist Party. And one of the objectives of those links is for the Chinese Communist Party to be able to acquire Canadian intellectual property, whether it's technical or anything else. It is the acquisition of technology that is of use to the party, and they will use those links to that end.
Is it your sense that, well, you put a fraction on it. Is it most, is it some Chinese Canadians have some fealty to the Communist Party of the People's Republic of China?
I think it's a very, very small minority, very, very small. And I think one of the unfortunate things here, in fact, I would say it's more than unfortunate, is the way that the Chinese Communist Party tries to appeal to a cultural loyalty, if you like, and a way of recruiting agents to work here in Canada against Canadians. I think it's a deplorable thing. And fortunately, there are very, very few, a minute minority who are susceptible to this pressure. But the Communist Party keeps doing it. And presumably they feel they have enough success with this to keep at it. But it must be underlined, the vast, vast, vast majority of Canadians of Chinese heritage are here for the simple reason, or one reason, that they do not wish to be controlled by the Chinese Communist Party.
Let's do an example that is very close to home for those of us who live in the province of Ontario, and that relates to a guy you talk about in one of the later chapters of your book, Michael Chan. Michael Chan was a Liberal member of the Ontario legislature. He was a cabinet minister in both the Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne governments. And he got caught up in some very, very tricky, I'll just call it tricky coverage in the Globe and Mail, and you've talked about him in the book as well. Talk about Michael Chan, if you would. Let's just leave it like that.
Yeah, I'm going to be a bit circumspect, Steve, because this is, as far as I'm aware, this is still a matter of a lawsuit between Michael Chan and the Globe and Mail. The story basically about Michael Chan is that he came to Canada in the late 60s with his family. He became an insurance broker. He turned to politics, I guess, in the 1970s. He was very much attracted by Pierre Trudeau's vision of multicultural Canada, so he became a Liberal. He became the MPP for Markham, and he was also involved after 1989 in some organizations that the United Front set up after the Tiananmen Square massacre to try to improve the reputation abroad and the image abroad of the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China. Chan says that he was only marginally involved in these organizations, and we must accept his word for that. Where this story, and as you said, he was elected and he became a minister in the McGuinty and Quinn governments, where it, in 2010, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service sent some officials along to Premier McGuinty's office and said, look, we are concerned about some of the activities of Michael Chan. And what exactly those concerns were have never been made public. All we have is what Michael Chan has said himself. And he has said that there were two issues, that the CSIS was concerned that he had asked the Chinese consul general in Toronto for a visa to visit China. And the worry was that having gone through this channel rather than official channels, that Chan would therefore be under some obligation to her and that she would feel it's right to ask him for a favor later on. The other one was that he owns property in China still. He denied both those things. There was also the aspect that he was on the telephone to the Chinese Consul General every day for a while. He says that they were talking about the organization of a cultural affair. Although, I mean, I think it was remarked at the time that it seemed that this is something that should have been done by officials lower down the line, not the Minister of Citizenship in the Ontario government and the Chinese Consul General. At any way, the Ontario officials went through the whole situation and decided that he had not breached the code of conduct, although, of course, that did then bring into definition what is the code of conduct, should the code of conduct be reviewed, and indeed it's probably one of those things that should be reviewed pretty frequently.
Well, we should say for the record, Michael Chan has denied that he had any improper relationship with the People's Republic of China. The Liberal governments of both McGuinty and Wynne also said the same thing, that he was a popular minister here because he raised a lot of money. He did a lot of business for the Ontario public with China, and you know that's the nature, period, full stop, of the relationship. I wonder whether you, in the course of writing the book, feel any sympathy for him, in as much as he was kind of inadvertently outed by a former head of CSIS at a conference at which members of the public were attending, and suddenly got swirled up in all these rumors. Now, if he's innocent and pure as the driven snow, he's been maligned pretty significantly here, has he not?
Well, there are a number of different views about his activities. As you say, he was a very popular member. He was also very active within the Liberal Party. He raised a lot of money. Within the Chinese community, though, or Chinese-Canadian community, Canadian-Chinese community, there are varying views of him. I quote in the book one member of the community who says, well, you know, if you wanted to run as a Liberal in Ontario and you were of Chinese heritage, you had to be pro-Beijing or you weren't going to get nominated as a candidate. Now, how fair that is, I don't know. I just reported what was said. But he was certainly a very potent and powerful person within the Ontario Liberal Party, that's for sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay, in our remaining moments here, let's talk about this. You write that Canada needs to find a, quote, less self-delusional, more courageous, more intelligent way of dealing with China. In your view, what does that look like?
Well, I think that has really been brought to the fore by the whole Huawei situation, hasn't it, Steve? I mean, this has really shown us, and particularly the kidnapping by Beijing of the two Canadians and holding them essentially hostage against the outcome of the Huawei and Wang Zhuwan affair. I think that we need to recognize basically that we have very different and often conflicting values. We are not going to, for example, be able to have a free trade agreement with China that is of any use at all because the Chinese government does not believe in the rule of law. It believes in taking hostages as bargaining chips in disputes. And we cannot allow ourselves to be open to that. But I think more generally, we need to ask ourselves, whenever questions of relations with China arise, what is in it for us? Now, too often, I think in the past, we have simply asked ourselves, well, that's nice. If we have greater relations, more expansive relations with China, then it'll all come right in the end. I think what we're seeing in the Huawei affair is that it doesn't all come right in the end, that we need to be a lot more careful in our definitions of what we're doing and a lot more careful about our objectives and what Canada is going to get out of any relationship.
Okay, having said that, though, and let's finish up on this. Having said that, are you at all concerned that the nature of your book will create not just wariness about the government of China, which I suspect most Canadians certainly would not want to live under that kind of a government, that it doesn't spill over into undue wariness, even xenophobia, for the people of China?
Well, that is why I've been very careful it was a difficult book to write just because of that question, Steve, as you can imagine. That is why I have referred throughout the book, not to China and not to the people of China, but to the Chinese Communist Party and to the Beijing regime. I have cast a long, hard line between those two because we are dealing with a specific political party in charge of a specific country to which it has not been elected as sovereign. And we should always keep that in mind. This is not about a book about Chinese people. It is not a book about China. It is a book about the Canadian relationship with a specific political party which happens to be the government of a country at this time in history.
In which case, I am happy to repeat the title. It is called Claws of the Panda, Beijing's Campaign of Influence and Intimidation in Canada. And for those who really love and are interested in Queen's Park, I want to remind them that our guest over the last 20 plus minutes has been the guy who wrote the first great book about the Tory dynasty at Queen's Park. It was called The Power and the Tories, and you probably wrote it 45 years ago, and it reads as good today as it did back then. Jonathan Manthorpe, thanks a lot for being on TVO tonight.
Thank you, Steve. My pleasure.